Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting Ant-Man, Giant Man, Vision and the Winter Soldier for Marvel Zombies. So as you can see, I've sprayed Vision and Ant-Man with some matte white spray, Winter Soldier with some matte black spray, and Giant Man with some sand-green red. And all of those paints are from Colourforge. So moving on to painting properly, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to dry brush Winter Soldier with some Corvus Black. This will be followed by a second dry brush, this time of Eshin Grey. From there we're going to use some Dryad Bark and we're going to paint all his pouches and his holster. Then I'll use some Xandri Dust to paint the pole sticking out of the zombie version's leg. Then moving on to Ant-Man, I'm going to use some Rhinox Hide and I'm going to paint all of the ant with that except the wings, apart from the very front of the wings. Then the pouches and the ant will receive a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. And while that wash dries, I'm going to move on to the Vision. Now for his green, but except his cloak, I'm going to use some Warpstone Glow. This will take a couple of coats, as it is a pretty thin colour, and the white does shine through quite brightly. He'll then receive a wash with some Beltan Green. Going back to the Winter Soldier, we're going to highlight those pouches with a 50-50 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothor Brown. And for the staff, we're simply just going to relayer the Xandri Dust, making sure we avoid any of the shading that we want to keep. This is basically at the end of the ropes and between the legs. For the ant, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown to dry brush the entirety of the ant body. This will be followed by a second dry brush. This time it's going to be Mournfang Brown just by itself. And then lastly a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown for the final highlight. Then I'm going to dry brush the Warpstone Glow back onto Vision once the wash has dried. And in a step you can entirely skip, make sure you accidentally drop your model. We'll then give it a second dry brush, this time with a 50-50 mix of Warpstone Glow and Moot Green. Next, we're going to go back to Ant-Man and we're going to use some Mephiston Red to paint Ant-Man himself. And then we're going to wash Ant-Man and Giant Man with some Carroburg Crimson. While that wash dries, we're going to move on to Bucky. I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel to paint any silver areas on him and the zombie version. And all of that silver will then get a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once those washes have dried, I'm going to re-dry brush the Mephiston Red onto Giant Man. Now this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sunz Scarlet for the second dry brush. And then I'll use some Evil Sunz Scarlet to start highlighting Ant-Man. And I'm also going to use it to pick out the red sections of the Vision. Then going back to dry brushing, I'm going to dry brush the Evil Sunz Scarlet onto Giant Man. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Evil Sunz Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. And I'll also paint that onto Ant-Man and Vision. Then lastly, I'll use Wild Rider Red just by itself for Vision and Ant-Man. And of course, once again, I'll dry brush it onto Giant Man. And then for one final dry brush on Giant Man, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Wild Rider Red and Matte White. This is a very light dry brush as well, just designed to pick out the absolute peaks and edges. Then I'm going to go back to Ant-Man and use some Iron Hand Steel to pick out any metallic parts on Ant-Man himself. And I'll wash those areas with a little bit of Nuln Oil. I'll then use some Moot Green to paint the Vision's cloak, and he's also got a couple of bits that need painting on his chest. Those areas will then get washed with some Beltan Green. To highlight any metal, I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormpost Silver. And this will be followed by Stormhost Silver just by itself. To paint the skin on Winter Soldier and Ant-Man, I'm going to use a little bit of Cadian Flesh Tone. However, for the zombie version of Winter Soldier and the zombie version of Giant Man, I'm going to use some Rakarth Flesh to paint any zombie skin. Then all the skin will be washed with some Reikland Flesh Shade. And while that dries, I'll start highlighting Vision's cloak. First thing I'm going to do is relayer the Moot Green, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Moot Green and Matte White. Moving on to painting the eyes for Vision and the hero version of the Winter Soldier. First thing I'm going to use is some Abaddon Black. And this will be followed by a little bit of Matte White. And then lastly, and just for the Winter Soldier, I'm going to use a tiny dot of Abaddon Black for the pupil. And then to highlight his skin, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh for the tiny amount of skin. This is the only bit of highlighting on his skin I'm going to do, but also don't forget to try and add a little bit of highlight to Ant-Man's skin as well, even though he is super small. For the star on his shoulder, first thing I'm going to use is some Mephiston Red. And this will be followed by a simple highlight of Evil Sunz Scarlet. Then to start highlighting the zombie skin on Giant Man, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Rakarth Flesh and Flayed One Flesh. And this will be followed by Flayed One Flesh just by itself, and at this point I'm also going to start highlighting the Winter Soldier's zombie version as well. Then before we go any further, I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Carroburg Crimson just to make the eyes look more sunken. And then I'll use a 50-50 mix of Flayed One Flesh and Pallid Witch Flesh to continue the highlight on Giant Man. And then lastly, Pallid Witch Flesh just by itself, and this is also the second highlight for the Winter Soldier. For the inside of both their mouths, I'm going to use a little bit of Screamer Pink. And this will be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Screamer Pink and Pink Horror. Then for the zombie eyes, I'm going to use some Wild Rider Red. And this will be followed by a little bit of Fire Dragon Bright. Then to paint the wings on Ant-Man's ant, I'm going to use some Wraithbone. And I'm also going to use that Wraithbone to paint Giant Man's teeth. Then both the wings and the teeth will receive a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. While that wash dries, we'll finish off the Vision's main colour scheme with a little bit of Avalanche Sunset for the gems, followed by some Flash Gitz Yellow, and then finally a 50-50 mix of Flash Gitz Yellow and Matte White. Moving back to Giant Man and Ant-Man, I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint any black areas. And then any silver on Giant Man's base, this includes his belt, I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel. Then his belt will receive a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once the wash on the wings have dried, I'm going to relayer with some Wraithbone. Don't forget to do the teeth as well. And then these will be highlighted with a 50-50 mix of Wraithbone and Matte White. And then for a final highlight on Giant Man's teeth, and to pick out the zombie version of Winter Soldier's teeth, I'm going to use a little bit of a Matte White. From there we'll move on to Giant Man's black and Ant-Man's as well, and the first thing we're going to do is use some Corvus Black to start highlighting. And this will be followed by some Eshin Grey. I'm also going to use that Eshin Grey to paint the strap that Ant-Man is holding that's keeping him on the end. Lastly, that Eshin Grey will also get used to paint the top of the bin that Giant Man is standing on. Then I'm going to finish off the Winter Soldier by painting his hair with some Dryad Bark. And then I'll wash any Eshin Grey and Dryad Bark with some Nuln Oil. For the bin that Giant Man's standing on, I'm going to paint that with some Macragge Blue, which I'll wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. For the door that's in his hand, I'm going to use some Avalanche Sunset, which will get a wash with some Kasandora Yellow. And while that wash dries, I'm then going to continue with painting all the rest of the bases with some Dawnstone. Then all that Dawnstone and most of the actual base themselves will get dry brushed with some Karak Stone. Then I'll use a little bit of Leadbelcher to dabble in some sort of chips and paintwork that's been scuffed on the bin and the car door. Then to paint Baron Zemo's mask on the Winter Soldier's base, I'm going to simply use some Screamer Pink. This will be followed by painting the Hydra logo behind him with some Evil Sunz Scarlet. And the gold piece of his helmet with some Retributor armor. There's a little bit of garbage sticking out of the bin on Giant Man's base, and for that I'm just going to simply use some Pallid Witch flesh. Next I'm going to paint all the rims of the bases with some Abaddon Black. And as the camera decides to focus on Giant Man and the paints in the background, I'm going to wash the bases with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Then all that's left to do is add a tiny bit of blood for the Blood God around the wounds on the Winter Soldier, and I'm going to add a small bit around Giant Man's mouth. Now there we are, that's all of them finished. I've got to say, I absolutely loved painting these guys. I really enjoyed painting the Giant Man. He is an absolute pleasure to paint. They also didn't take too long whatsoever. The Giant Man obviously going to be taking the longest. They came in around about 6 hours for all 5 of them. But that's mostly due to the fact they are very, very simple models to paint. If you watched this video and you found it useful, I really do hope you found it useful. And if you want to see more, we've got plenty more Marvel Zombie stuff on the channel, as well as Marvel Crisis Protocol, some Star Wars Shatterpoint, and some 40k stuff as well. And all I have to say is, well, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now. And I hope you have as much fun painting these guys as I did.